Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material.
And today we are actually jumping into some pretty wild territory.
Yeah, we really are. I mean, we're looking at a guy who touches a sacred box to literally just stop it from falling, and he is struck dead on the spot.
Right, instantly.
And then we are looking at this bizarre, massive, multinational war that gets sparked over, of all things, half-shaved beards.
It is so strange to read, yeah.
Totally. And then we're going to unpack this devastating national plague that wipes out tens of thousands of people. And the craziest part is it's all caused by something that seems as innocent as, like, a simple government census.
It really is a staggering series of events. I mean, it's chaotic. And it all revolves around one central figure.
Right. King David.
Exactly. We are plunging deep into the ancient texts of First Chronicles, specifically chapters 13 through 21.
So we're putting a microscope on him?
We are. And not when he was this scrappy underdog hiding in caves. We are looking at David right at the absolute undisputed height of his power.
Which is usually the danger zone, right?
Oh, absolutely. If you study leadership or history, or even just human psychology, you know that the pinnacle of success is almost always the most dangerous place for a human being to stand.
And that is the exact mission of this deep dive today. We are taking these ancient chapters and holding them up as a mirror for you.
A mirror for modern leadership, really.
Exactly. For ambition, for how we handle success. It's this brilliant and honestly sometimes terrifying study in the pitfalls of the human ego.
It really is. And to navigate all this, we're drawing directly from the historical text, obviously. But we are also layering in the classical, incredibly detailed historical and theological commentaries of Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
Right. These are the heavy hitters.
Yeah, these scholars spent decades, literally decades, decoding the geopolitical, the cultural, and the spiritual context of these ancient events.
And they pull out insights that just completely reframe how we see these stories today.
They do.
Yeah.
And honestly, we need that reframing immediately, because the very first major event in this stretch of history is, well, it's one of the most notoriously difficult, jarring moments for a modern mind to process.
Oh, yeah. The cart incident.
Yes. So let's set the stage. David is newly established as king over all Israel. The civil wars are finally over.
He's got the crown, the military support, the new capital city of Jerusalem. He is set.
He is. And the commentator Matthew Henry points out something deeply revealing about David's character in this exact moment.
Right, because usually, when a king consolidates that kind of power, the very first thing they do is build a massive monument to themselves.
Or they throw a lavish banquet to prove how untouchable they are.
Exactly. Just a big ego trip.
But David doesn't ask, what pompous thing shall I do? Henry notes that David's immediate instinct is actually to ask, what pious thing can I do?
Wow, that is a huge difference.
It is. He wants to use his newfound consolidated power to elevate the sacred. So he decides to retrieve the Ark of the Covenant.
Okay, so for anyone who needs a quick refresher, the Ark is this sacred chest containing the tablets of the Ten Commandments.
Right. And it had been essentially neglected, just left in obscurity in a place called Kiriath Jearim for decades.
So David wants to bring it to the center of the nation.
Exactly. He consults with his military commanders and civilian leaders, and they organize this massive, joyous, nationwide parade to bring the Ark to the new capital.
And here is where it all goes horribly wrong.
So wrong.
Because to transport this incredibly important, heavy, gold-covered chest, they decide to place it on a brand new cart driven by oxen.
Which, makes sense.
Right. From a modern logistical standpoint, that makes total sense. It's efficient. It's an upgrade. Why carry something super heavy when you can use the latest agricultural technology to literally just roll it?
Right. Work smarter, not harder.
Exactly. But then they reach this place, the threshing floor of Chidon. The oxen stumble.
The cart tip.
And a man named Uzza instinctively reaches out his hand to steady the ark so it doesn't crash into the dirt.
Just a reflex.
And the text says God's anger burned against Uzza and he is struck dead on the spot. Instant fatality. The music stops. The celebration completely dies.
It induces absolute terror. I mean, David is completely derailed by this.
He freaks out, right?
He is so frightened that he literally parks the ark at the nearby house of a man named Obed-Edom and flat out refuses to bring it into Jerusalem. He abandons the entire mission.
Okay, I have to pause everything right here. I have to push back aggressively on behalf of basically anyone listening to this deep dive right now.
I completely understand why.
Because to our modern sensibilities, this feels completely insane. Uzza was literally just trying to help.
Right.
The oxen tripped, gravity happened, he had good intentions. I look at this and it feels like getting fired, or in this case, executed, for diving across the room to catch your boss's priceless falling
It
vase.
seems like a massive overreaction.
It does. How can we possibly extract any wisdom from a response that seems so deeply disproportionate and honestly unfair?
Yeah, that visceral reaction of unfairness is the exact obstacle we have to deconstruct if we were really going to understand the ancient concept of wisdom here.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, our modern culture operates on a very specific assumption, right? We believe that good intentions are the ultimate moral defense.
Yeah, totally. Like, I meant well.
Exactly. If my heart was in the right place, I should be shielded from consequence. But Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry both point out a radically different reality regarding the ark.
Because it wasn't just a box.
Right. God had established strict, highly detailed, non-negotiable laws about how this specific object was to be handled. It wasn't just a piece of religious furniture. To the ancient Israelites, it represented the potent, unshielded, localized presence of the divine.
Okay, so it's not just a symbol, it's physically active. But still, a guy tries to stop it from getting dirty and dies.
Let's think about the mechanics of how we treat power in our own world. Let's step away from the human emotion of it for a second and look at, say, a high-voltage power line.
Okay, a power line.
A high-voltage line carries immense life-sustaining energy for a whole city. It's incredibly good and necessary, but it requires incredibly strict protocol to handle safely.
Yeah, definitely.
So, if a severe storm knocks down a power pole and live, uninsulated wires whipping around in the middle of the street, what happens if you run up and grab it with your bare hand?
You die instantly.
Exactly. But does it matter if your intention was good?
Oh, I see what you're doing.
Does it matter if you were just trying to move it out of the way so a little child wouldn't step on it?
Wow, yeah, not to the electricity. The electricity doesn't care about my heart.
Precisely. The power line isn't angry at you in a human, petty, emotional sense. It's just operating according to its inherent nature.
It's just power.
Right. If you grab a live wire without the proper insulation, without the thick rubber gloves, without the strict safety protocols, the power will destroy you, regardless of how pure your motives are.
That is heavy.
And that's what the commentators are getting at. The ancient concept of holiness wasn't just about moral perfection. It was about an overwhelming, dangerous, raw reality.
So Uzza's action wasn't just a mistake.
No, his good intentions paired with the wrong protocol wasn't just a tragic mistake. In the ancient mindset, it was actually a form of lethal arrogance.
Arrogance? How so?
It was the assumption that human sincerity overrides divine law, that your desire to help lets you ignore the safety manual of the universe.
Wow. That high voltage analogy completely flips the script for me because it removes the image of a petty deity throwing a tantrum and replaces it with the reality of interacting with a genuinely overwhelming force.
The ark is the live wire.
Yes. And David actually figures this out, doesn't he? Because the story doesn't just end with the ark sitting in Obed-Edom's living room forever.
No, it doesn't. Fast forward 3 months to chapters 15 and 16.
Okay, what happens?
Well, Obed-Edom's entire household has been wildly blessed just by having the ark nearby. The presence of it brings life and prosperity when it's respected.
It's not just a death box. It brings good things.
Right. So David decides to try again. But this time, he completely changes his approach. He goes back to the manual.
He actually reads the instructions this time.
He does. He realizes that the new cart method wasn't an Israelite instruction at all.
Wait, really? Where did he get it?
It was how the Philistines, their pagan neighbors, transported things. The Philistines had actually previously moved the ark on a cart years prior.
Oh, so David had basically tried to import a foreign, efficient, convenient method to handle the sacred core of his own faith.
Exactly. He treated it like a common logistical problem. So he looks at his leaders and he says, none ought to carry the ark of God but the Levites.
The Levites being the specific priestly tribe, right?
Yes. In our analogy, the Levites are the authorized, heavily insulated technicians. And the instruction manual was crystal clear. They were commanded to carry the ark on their own shoulders, using long wooden poles inserted through gold rings on the chest.
So nobody touches the box itself?
No one was ever supposed to touch the box itself.
So the shortcut was the real problem. The attempt to automate the process, to put it on a cart and let the beasts of burden do all the sweating, is what created the vulnerability that got Uzza killed.
That is the absolute core of it. The weight of the sacred must be borne personally. You cannot outsource it to an ox or a piece of technology.
That is profound.
And notice David's reaction here. Matthew Henry spends a lot of time on David's humility in this moment.
Because he could have been bitter.
A lesser king would have blamed the oxen, or blamed Uzza for being clumsy, or even complained that God was being totally unreasonable.
But what does he do?
David says, "The Lord our God broke out against us because we did not seek him according to the due order." He takes total responsibility for prioritizing efficiency over reverence.
Due order. I like that phrase. And the level of detail they go into for this second attempt is staggering.
It really is.
It's the total opposite of that casual, sloppy parade from the first try. Barnes goes into some deep linguistic analysis about the organization of the musicians alone.
Yeah, the music was highly structured.
David doesn't just say, "Hey, everybody sing loudly." He structures the Levites with incredible precision. Barnes points out the specific Hebrew musical terms. They used stringed instruments pitched high on alamoth, which translates roughly to the register of young women's voices to carry the melody.
Very specific.
And then they balanced that with harps pitched an octave lower on the sheminith to provide the deep, resonant harmony. They even appoint a master of the song, Chenaniah, specifically because he was highly skillful and trained.
It's a complete masterclass in due order.
Right.
They're treating the presence of God with the highest possible intellectual and artistic rigor.
No more unbridled, sweaty enthusiasm.
Right. It was careful. It was measured. It was deeply intentional reverence. And the Levites, physically, putting their own shoulders under those poles. They carried the heavy, crushing weight of that gold-covered chest, step by step, all the way into Jerusalem.
So if we take this ancient lesson of due order and the physical weight of the ark, and we translate it into our 21st century lives, where do you see us repeating David's first mistake? Like, where are we building carts today?
Oh, we build carts everywhere.
Yeah.
Because modern society worships at the altar of efficiency. We are absolutely terrified of bearing weight.
That is so true. Give me an example.
Think about our relationships. We try to put our deepest human connections on a cart all the time. We substitute the heavy, awkward, time-consuming work of face-to-face vulnerability with quick text messages.
Or perfectly curated social media updates.
Exactly. We want the blessing of intimacy without the friction of actual presence.
Wow. Or we put our ethics on a cart, right? Like, we look for the most convenient, legally permissible workaround in our business dealings, rather than carrying the heavy weight of doing the rigorously honest, ethically complex right thing.
Absolutely. We even do it with our personal growth and our spiritual lives.
How so?
We want profound inner peace. We want deep wisdom. But we try to achieve it by listening to a 3-minute TikTok summary while multitasking.
Guilty.
Instead of sitting in silence, doing the heavy lifting of deep study, meditation, and difficult self-reflection, we want the presence of the ark. We want the blessing it brings to our lives. But we want the oxen to do all the sweating.
That is incredibly convicting. You cannot outsource the heavy lifting of a meaningful life.
You really can't.
So for you listening right now, here's a practice to take with you today. Look at your life and identify one good goal you have right now. Maybe it's a relationship, a career milestone, or a personal habit.
Just one thing you're striving for.
Yeah. And ask yourself, am I compromising on the right process to get there? Am I trying to automate or shortcut something that actually requires my personal shoulder to bear the weight? Because good intentions will not save you if you completely neglect the due order.
That is a great reflection, and that shift from convenience to bearing the weight, it really sets up the very foundation of David's kingdom in Jerusalem. But it's fascinating how quickly the tests change for him.
Oh, because he figures out the internal stuff, so the external world comes for him.
Exactly. Once you establish your internal spiritual center, the external world usually comes knocking pretty fast.
And that takes us right into chapters 14 and 20.
All right.
David has the ark. His kingdom is rising in prominence. In fact, Hiram, the king of Tyre, which is this wealthy neighboring maritime power, sends him cedar trees, stonemasons, and carpenters to build David a luxurious royal palace.
He is hitting the big time.
He is experiencing the intoxicating effects of undeniable success. But right in the middle of this architectural triumph, the Philistines, his oldest enemies, decide he is getting just a little too powerful.
They don't like the new palace.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
So they amass their armies and attack in a place called the Valley of Rephaim.
And this is a really critical juncture. David has a standing army. He is a proven, battle-hardened military commander. He knows how to fight.
Right.
But before he deploys a single soldier, before he even draws a sword, he engages in a practice that basically defines his greatness at this stage of his life.
Yeah.
He asks God for direction.
He pauses to ask.
Yes. He inquires, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand?" And the oracle, the divine response, is incredibly clear. It just says, "Go up."
And so he does.
He attacks, and he wins a massive, decisive victory. He completely crushes them.
Okay, that makes sense. He asked for strategy, he gave the green light, and he executed it flawlessly.
Simple enough.
But here is where the narrative introduces this brilliant twist on human nature. Shortly after that massive defeat, the Philistines regroup and they attack again. And they attack in the exact same location, the Valley of Rephaim. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a military general or like a modern CEO.
Okay.
If an aggressive competitor attacks your market share using the exact same tactic in the exact same territory where you just beat them last quarter, what do?
Oh, you run the exact same play.
Yeah.
You rely on your proven formula.
Right. You pull out the playbook that worked flawlessly 3 months ago. It's like refusing to download a software update because version 1.0 worked perfectly fine last year. Why would you mess with success?
And that right there is the ultimate trap of success. It's the assumption that past victories guarantee future results.
But David doesn't fall for it.
No, he does something highly unusual for a powerful leader. He doesn't assume anything. The text says David inquired of God again.
He goes back to square one.
He returns to a posture of total dependence, acting as if he knows nothing, despite his recent massive victory. And it is a very good thing he didn't run the old play.
Because the answer changes.
Completely. The terrain might have been the same, but the divine strategy completely shifted. God tells him, "Do not go up after them. Turn away from them and come around to them opposite the mulberry trees."
So an ambush tactic this time, flank them.
Right, but the instruction gets even more specific and, honestly, kind of strange.
Yeah, God says, when you hear a sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, then go out to battle, for God has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines.
It's amazing.
Wait for the sound of marching in the tops of the trees. That is such a vivid, almost cinematic detail. I love it. But why? Why make this highly trained army wait in the brush for the wind to hit the leaves?
Because it requires active, moment-by-moment discipline. It forces David and his men to keep their ears tuned to a higher frequency.
They can't just operate on autopilot.
Exactly. They couldn't just charge in based on their own adrenaline or their own timeline. They had to wait for the signal that they were partnering with a force larger than themselves.
And translated to today.
In the 21st century, the failure to listen for the sound in the trees destroys successful organizations every single day.
I can totally see that.
A company finds a product market fit, right?
Yeah.
They scale rapidly, they become dominant, and then they stop asking the oracle.
They stop looking around.
They stop surveying the landscape, they stop innovating, they just assume they know best because they won yesterday, and then the market shifts slightly, and they get routed in the exact same valley they thought they owned.
Complacency is definitely the dark shadow of success.
It really is.
But, we need to pause here for a second, because as we look at David's prosperity and his military campaigns, there are some deeply uncomfortable realities in these chapters that we promise not to gloss over.
Yes, we have to talk about this.
We're using these texts as a mirror, but some parts of this mirror reflect a very harsh ancient world. Amidst all this prosperity in chapter 14, the text almost casually mentions that David took more wives and concubines in Jerusalem and had many more children.
Yeah. And as modern readers, that immediately triggers alarm bells. We cannot just brush past it as, oh, well, times were different.
Right. It feels gross.
And Matthew Henry actually provides a very sharp critique of David right here. He points out that this multiplication of wives was a direct violation of the earlier laws given to the kings of Israel in the Torah.
Wait, really? The law explicitly forbade it?
Yes, the Torah explicitly commanded the king not to multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Henry describes this as David yielding to the flesh. It was a sign of growing indulgent, secure, and morally compromised amid his extreme prosperity.
And if you know the broader history of David, this specific indulgence, this sprawling, fractured, polyamorous royal household, it becomes the very thing that breeds the jealousy, the infighting, and the eventual civil wars that tear his family and his kingdom apart in his later years.
It completely destroys him from the inside.
The seeds of his destruction were planted during his highest prosperity.
Exactly. And the other uncomfortable reality we really must confront is the nature of the warfare described in chapter 20.
Oh, yeah. The violence.
When David's army captures the city of Rabbah from the Ammonites, the text says David brought out the people who were in it and set them to work with saws and iron picks and axes.
Which sounds like forced labor at first.
But some historical translations and commentaries, and indeed standard practices of ancient Near Eastern warfare, suggest a brutal physical punishment or execution using these implements.
It is incredibly brutal, saws and iron harrows. And we have to be absolutely clear here. We are impartially reporting the contents of these ancient texts. We do not endorse or sanitize ancient brutality or polygamy.
Not at all.
The challenge for us is to view these events through the unvarnished historical reality of the ancient Near East.
Right, because the geopolitical reality of the Iron Age was ruthlessly violent. Nations maintained borders and deterred rebellion through absolute terror-inducing displays of force.
So how do we read this today without just tossing the whole book out?
Right. Our task as modern readers is to practice discernment. We have to separate the enduring wisdom like David's humility in seeking strategic guidance at the mulberry trees from the era-specific cultural norms and moral failures that we rightly reject today.
That makes sense.
We can learn from his dependence on the divine without condoning his marital choices or the savagery of his military conquests.
That is such a vital skill. The ability to learn from flawed figures without having to idolize their entire lives.
Exactly.
And speaking of military conquests, chapter 20 ends with a really fascinating illustrative detail. It talks about the lingering giants of Gath.
Oh, I love this part.
Now, everyone knows the story of David as a young shepherd boy killing the giant Goliath. That's famous. But decades later, these relatives of Goliath are still around.
Lingering problems.
Yes, and one of them is described as a man of great stature who had 24 fingers and toes, 6 on each hand, 6 on each foot.
Mutated giants.
Literally. Mutated, terrifying giants. But the insight here is brilliant when we pull it into a modern context. Think about the arc of a career or a long-term project. David had already defeated the main famous enemy, Goliath, when he was young. That was his defining victory.
Put him on the map.
Right. But long after the primary enemy is defeated, long after the startup has launched or the major crisis is averted, these bizarre, mutated, intimidating, lingering problems still pop up.
The giants don't all go away just because you killed the biggest one.
Exactly.
And notice the mechanism of their defeat here. David, who is now older and carrying the weight of the crown, doesn't have to go out with his sling and fight them all himself.
He doesn't micromanage the giants.
No, he doesn't.
Yeah.
The text specifically says these remaining giants fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Sibbecai the Hushite kills one. Elhanan kills another. Jonathan, David's nephew, defeats the one with 24 toes.
So the lesson is really about empowering your people. You deal with the Goliath early on, but you have to train your team to be ready for the guy with 24 toes.
Exactly. Specialized, lingering problems require specialized courage from your team. A great leader doesn't fight every battle forever. They cultivate an environment where their servants become giant slayers themselves.
I love that so much. So David has secured his borders, he's empowered his generals to handle the lingering threats, and he has established this flawless, highly ordered system of worship with the Ark.
Things are stable.
Very stable. He is sitting in his brand new, luxurious cedar palace. But as he looks out his window, he sees the Ark, the very center of his faith and his kingdom's identity, sitting in a temporary tent.
Yeah, it's a striking contrast.
And that discrepancy births his most ambitious idea yet, which transitions us right into chapter 17.
The disparity really bothers him deeply. He calls in Nathan the prophet, who's essentially his trusted spiritual advisor, and he pitches an incredible vision.
What does he say?
She says, look, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord is under a tent. David wants to build a permanent, magnificent architectural wonder. He wants to build a temple for God.
A legacy project.
Exactly. And Nathan, operating purely on logical human enthusiasm, immediately signs off on it. He says, do all that is in your heart, for God is with you.
Which makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't God want a magnificent temple? Why wouldn't a prophet encourage the king to fund a massive religious infrastructure project?
On paper, it's a great idea. But that very night, The divine perspective interrupts the human logic. The word of God comes to Nathan, and God issues a hard, unequivocal stop.
A full red light.
God tells Nathan to go back to David and say, "You shall not build me a house to dwell in."
And let's look at the psychology of that moment. I think a highly driven modern leader would absolutely lose their mind here.
Oh, without a doubt.
Imagine a wildly successful billionaire CEO. They've crushed the competition, they've made their fortune, and now they want to pivot to philanthropy.
They want their name on a building.
Right. They go to their board of directors and say, I want to personally fund a massive, benevolent, billion-dollar legacy project. I want to cure a disease and put my name on the institute. And the board just rejects it. Usually, a powerful leader throws an absolute tantrum. They say, fine, I'll take my money elsewhere. If I can't be the architect, I'm not participating.
That is the standard ego response for sure.
Yeah.
But let's analyze how God frames this rejection, because it is a profound lesson in identity. God doesn't just say no. He grounds David by reminding him of his origins.
What does he remind him of?
God says, "I took you from the sheepcote, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people." God is reminding David, look, your identity is a shepherd, a warrior, and a unifier. You have shed blood. You have fought the wars to create the peace. But you are not the builder of temples.
Wow. Know your role.
Exactly. And then God completely flips the script on the whole concept of legacy.
It's the ultimate turn of phrase.
He says to David, "You won't build me a house. Instead, I will build you a house."
Chills.
But he isn't talking about cedar and stone. He is talking about a dynasty. God promises that David's lineage will endure and that it will be David's son, raised in an era of peace, who will actually build the physical temple.
And David's response is just breathtaking. He doesn't pout. He doesn't storm out. He goes in, sits down before the Lord in that very tent and says, "Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house, that you have brought me this far?"
Incredible humility.
He is overwhelmed with gratitude despite being told no to his absolute biggest dream.
It is the absolute epitome of accepting the limits of your role. Matthew Henry makes a brilliant observation right here. He points out that David must not think his preserment, his entire rise to power, was in vain, simply because he wasn't permitted to do this specific project.
Right. His life still had immense meaning.
Exactly. And that is a brutal lesson for high achievers. Sometimes we are the preparers, not the builders.
So let's translate this for you listening right now. We live in a culture that is utterly obsessed with immediate, visible legacy. We want our names carved in the stone.
We want the plaque.
We want the credit for the finished product. We want to be there for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. If we start a project, we want to be the one to finish it.
We do. But David is forced to accept that his job is just to secure the site and gather the materials. His son, Solomon, will do the actual building.
That requires so much surrender.
It requires a profound dismantling of the ego to pour your sweat, your wealth, and your energy into gathering blueprints and gold, knowing someone else will get the credit for the architecture.
Oh, man.
If we connect this to the broader human experience, it perfectly mirrors that beautiful ancient Greek proverb.
Which one?
A society grows great when old men plant trees under whose shade they know they shall never sit. David had to find deep, abiding peace in being a stepping stone.
I think that is one of the hardest leadership transitions anyone can make. To transition from I am the builder to I am the tree planter.
It really is.
So here's the reflection for you today. Look at your life, your career, your family. What project, what vision, or what aspect of your work do you need to prepare and willingly hand over to the next generation without resentment?
That's the key, without resentment.
Where do you need to practice yielding control? Can you find deep satisfaction in being the preparer rather than the person who gets to sit in the shade?
It's a beautiful place of humility to reach. But, the tragedy of human interaction is that even if you humbly accept your limited role and dismantle your own ego, you can still get dragged into absolute chaos.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you can't control the unmanaged paranoia of the people around you.
Which catapults us directly into the geopolitical nightmare of chapters 18 and 19. David is humble at home, but abroad, a catastrophic misunderstanding sparks a massive war.
It really is a tragedy.
It's the story of Hanun and the Ammonites, and it plays out like a dark comedy of errors that ends in an absolute bloodbath.
Let's lay out the diplomatic setup first.
Yeah.
Nahash, the king of Ammon, a neighboring nation, dies. His son Hanun takes the throne. Now, David remembers that Nahash had shown him kindness in the past during his years on the run from Saul. So David decides to do the honorable, neighborly, diplomatic thing. He sends a delegation of royal ambassadors to comfort Hanun on the loss of his father and express solidarity.
It is a purely kind, empathetic gesture, no ulterior motives whatsoever.
Just a condolence visit.
But when the ambassadors arrive, Hanan's princes, his inner circle of advisors, prove to be deeply pathologically paranoid.
Toxic advisors.
They whisper in the young king's ear, "Do you really think David is honoring your father? Look at these men. Aren't they spies sent to search the city and overthrow it?"
And Hanan, likely very insecure in his new power, listens to the toxic advice. But he doesn't just, politely deport the ambassadors. He decides to send a message.
Horrible message.
He takes David's men, shaves off half of their beards, and cuts their garments right off in the middle, exposing their buttocks, and sends them marching back home.
We really need to understand the cultural weight of this. In the ancient Near East, a man's beard was the ultimate symbol of his dignity, his freedom, and his honor.
Slaves were often shaven.
Right. And cutting their garments to expose their lower halves was meant to inflict the ultimate degrading shame. It wasn't just a college prank. It was a highly calculated, deeply offensive cultural humiliation.
It was meant to break them.
When David hears about it, he is so protective of his men's dignity that he tells them to wait in the city of Jericho until their beards grow back so they don't have to face the public embarrassment in Jerusalem.
He takes care of his guys.
He does. But meanwhile, the Ammonites realize what they've just done. They realize they've just poked a sleeping bear.
And instead of apologizing, they double down. They take 1,000 talents of silver, an astronomical sum of money, and they go out and hire tens of thousands of Syrian mercenaries with chariots and horsemen to fight David.
Just escalating it to the moon.
They drag multiple nations into a war to cover up their own initial paranoia.
And thousands upon thousands of people die on the battlefield. It is the ultimate geopolitical disaster born entirely of a simple misunderstanding.
It's tragic.
It's exactly like a modern corporate nightmare, honestly. Someone misreads the tone of a Slack message or an email. Because of their own insecurity, they instantly assume malice.
Oh, I've seen this happen.
Right. They CC the entire company with an aggressive response. HR gets involved. Factions are formed, and suddenly a corporate civil war destroys the entire department. All because someone assumed a compliment was actually a threat.
The psychological mechanics are absolutely identical. Matthew Henry provides a brilliant, penetrating insight here. He quotes the ancient proverb, "Wickedness proceedeth from the wicked."
What does he mean by that?
What he means is that Hanun and his advisors projected their own deceitful nature onto David's genuine kindness. When you are an inherently untrustworthy person, when you operate through manipulation and deceit, you automatically assume everyone else is trying to scam you.
Because that's what you would do.
Exactly. You view every extended hand as a threat because you would only extend a hand to hide a dagger. They couldn't fathom a leader acting out of simple kindness because they possessed no simple kindness themselves.
Oh, man. The psychology of projection. The people who are most paranoid about being cheated are usually the ones cutting corners in their own lives. They project their shadow onto everyone else.
Precisely. And this raises a highly practical question for our modern lives. How often do paranoia, toxic advice, and the reflexive assumption of bad intentions destroy our relationships, our marriages, and our organizations today?
All the time.
We create enemies out of potential friends because we listen to the fearful voices in our own heads. Or worse, we listen to the toxic whispers of insecure advisors who tell us to protect ourselves at all costs.
So the takeaway here for you is about how you process intent. When someone offers you help, or when a colleague gives you constructive feedback, do you immediately look for the catch?
Do you assume they're out to get you?
Exactly. Do you assume they're trying to undermine you? Your challenge today is to practice a radical shift in perspective. Assume positive intent until definitively proven otherwise.
That's powerful.
Do not start a catastrophic emotional or professional war over a phantom insult. Don't let the toxic advisors in your own head turn you into Hanun.
It is profound warning about the company you keep and the assumptions you harbor. But even if you survive the external wars, as David does, he decisively defeats the Ammonites and the Syrians. The most insidious threat to a leader isn't a foreign army.
No, it's not. And that brings us to chapter 21. This is arguably the darkest, most theologically complex, and most devastating chapter in this entire study.
It is a very tough chapter.
David has survived the wars. He has defeated the mutated giants. His borders are perfectly secure. He is phenomenally wealthy and successful, but his greatest threat comes from within his own palace. It is a spiritual attack on his own ego.
The text opens with a chilling, abrupt statement. It says, Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel.
So David decides he needs to take a military census.
He commands his generals to go through all the tribes, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, and count exactly how many sword-drawing men he has at his disposal.
And his top general, Joab, pushes back hard. And keep in mind, Joab is a gritty, ruthless, blood-soaked military man. He's not a priest. He is not a sensitive spiritual advisor.
No, he's a killer.
Yet even Joab begs the king not to do it. Joab says, "May the Lord multiply his people 100 times. But aren't they all your servants? Why does my Lord require this thing? Why will he be a cause of guilt unto Israel?"
He knows it's wrong.
But David is obstinate. The king's word prevails. He forces the census. The count comes back, over 1 million men who draw the sword. But God is highly displeased.
Very displeased.
And God sends a prophet named Gad to offer David 3 horrific, terrifying punishments to choose from.
The options are staggering. 3 years of famine devastating the land, 3 months of being swept away and destroyed by his human foes, or 3 days of the sword of the Lord, a supernatural pestilence, a plague upon the land.
He has to pick his poison.
David is trapped in an agonizing strait. He makes the calculation that it is better to fall into the hands of God, whose mercies are great, than into the hands of unforgiving men. He chooses the 3 days of plague.
And the result is devastating.
A destroying angel moves through the land, and 70,000 Israelites die.
Okay, hold on. We have to stop everything right here and address the massive elephant in the room. What is so inherently evil about a census?
It's the big question.
Governments do it all the time. Our modern governments are constitutionally mandated to do it every 10 years. It's just data collection. It's demographics. Why on earth is this considered a sin, let alone a sin so severe that it warrants a plague that kills 70,000 people?
It is arguably the biggest obstacle for the modern reader in the entire book. To understand this, we have to look past the bureaucratic action of counting and look directly at the motive.
Okay, what was the motive?
Both Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry stressed that the sin wasn't mathematics. The sin was pure, unadulterated pride, self-reliance, and ownership.
Explain the ownership part to me.
Up until now, David's defining strength was that he relied entirely on the invisible protection of God. Remember the mulberry trees?
He asked for direction.
He knew the kingdom belonged to God and he was just the steward. But now, in his ultimate prosperity, a shift has occurred. He is counting his military strength so he can rely on his numbers.
He wants concrete data.
He wants to look at a spreadsheet and feel secure. And worse, by numbering them, he is implicitly treating the free people of Israel as his personal asset, his property, his capital to boast about to the surrounding nations.
He went from trusting the invisible divine to trusting his visible data. He shifted from stewardship to ownership.
Exactly. And there's a fascinating theological nuance here that Barnes highlights regarding the origin of this impulse.
Oh, about who provoked him.
Yes. The text in Chronicles says Satan provoked David. But in the parallel historical account in 2 Samuel, it says God moved against Israel and incited David.
That seems like a massive contradiction. How do commentators reconcile that?
The ancient understanding is that God permitted the adversary to present the temptation in order to test David and reveal the arrogant pride that had slowly, silently calcified in his heart during his years of extreme comfort.
So the census just brought it to the surface.
The census was just the outward symptom of an inward disease.
That makes profound sense in our modern context. Think about our absolute obsession with metrics today. We are surrounded by KPIs, follower counts, subscriber growth charts, bank balances, quarterly revenue reports.
Metrics are everywhere.
Measuring things isn't inherently evil. Data is necessary. But the spiritual danger is exactly the same. When does measuring our success transition from healthy tracking to placing our ultimate psychological security in the numbers?
When does the chart become your God?
Right. When do we start looking at our employees, our customers, or our social media followers, not as human beings with dignity, but as mere data points to inflate our own egos?
That right there is the modern equivalent of David's census. When you find your safety in the head count, in the sheer volume of your assets, rather than in your core values, your ethics, and your reliance on what is good and true, you have fallen into the exact same trap.
But even if we understand the pride behind the census, we still have to address the fallout, because it is horrific. 70,000 people die for the king's pride.
It's awful.
To a modern individualist, that sounds like a rigged game. It sounds like 70,000 innocent people took a bullet for an executive's ego trip. How do we extract wisdom from something that feels so deeply unfair?
It is profoundly uncomfortable. And to grasp it, we have to understand the ancient sociological framework of corporate solidarity.
Corporate solidarity, what is that?
In the ancient Near Eastern mind, society was not a collection of isolated individuals like we view it today in the West. The leader and the people were inextricably, organically linked. The king was the literal proxy for the nation before the divine. They were the head and the body.
So they shared the fate.
When the head is sick, the body suffers. When the leader sins, the nation bears the consequence.
And honestly, if we strip away the ancient terminology, we see brutal echoes of corporate solidarity today.
We do.
When a modern CEO makes a massive, unethical decision driven by pure ego and greed, and the company collapses, who loses their livelihoods? Who loses their pensions?
The thousands of frontline workers.
Exactly, the people in the warehouses.
The consequences of leadership failure always roll downhill and crush the vulnerable. That is the tragic reality of human hierarchy. But this is where David's character breaks through the darkness.
Because he doesn't run away.
No. When David physically sees the destroying angel standing between earth and heaven with a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem, he doesn't hide in his fortified cedar palace. He doesn't blame his advisors.
No, he and the elders fall on their faces, clothed in sackcloth. And David utters one of the most agonizing, beautiful prayers of radical repentance in all of ancient literature.
It is so raw.
He says to God, "Is it not I that commanded the people to be numbered? Even I it is that have sinned and done evil indeed. But as for these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray thee, O Lord my God, be on me and on my father's house, but not on your people, that they should be plagued."
He begs to take the punishment.
He stops making excuses. He steps in front of the blade. He takes ultimate, radical responsibility.
And that posture of total brokenness is what breaks the judgment. God commands the angel to halt. And the angel stops precisely over a threshing floor, owned by a Jebusite man named Ornan.
Ornan the farmer.
Through the prophet Gad, God tells David to go up and build an altar to the Lord right there on that threshing floor to make atonement. And the interaction that follows between David the king and Ornan the farmer is the perfect, poetic resolution to this entire study.
Let's look at that interaction because it's really fascinating. David approaches Ornan with his royal entourage to buy the land. Ornan is terrified because he and his sons can literally see the angel hovering there.
They're hiding.
Ornan bows to the king and says, "Take it. I will give you the land for free. I'll give you the oxen for the burnt offering. Take the wooden threshing sledges for the fire, and the wheat for the grain offering. It's all yours, completely free of charge. Just make it stop."
It's the ultimate discount. The king is being offered the perfect, convenient way out, but David absolutely refuses.
He won't take it.
He looks at Ornan and says, "No, but I will verily buy it for the full price. For I will not take that which is yours for the Lord, nor offer burnt offerings without cost." He insists on paying Ornan 600 shekels of gold by weight.
Which is a huge amount. Why is David so adamant about paying full price when he absolutely doesn't have to?
Because he finally understands the nature of devotion. His sin was cheap devotion, pridefully counting people and assets that didn't really belong to him, treating God's people as his own free property.
He was treating everything as his right.
Right. He realizes he cannot mend a sin of arrogance with a freebie. True devotion requires actual sacrifice. If he uses Ornan's free oxen and free wood, it's Ornan's sacrifice, not David's.
Precisely. Albert Barnes notes a beautiful historical footnote here about the location, too.
Oh, about Gibeon.
Yeah. The original ancient tabernacle of Moses and the altar of burnt offering were actually located a few miles away at a high place in Gibeon. Logically, David should have gone there to sacrifice.
That was the official site.
But Barnes points out from the text that David was too terrified of the angel's drawn sword to make the journey. He was paralyzed by the reality of his own fragility. So God graciously met David exactly where he was, in his terror, in his guilt, on a dirty agricultural threshing floor.
He didn't make him walk to the perfect place.
And when David made that costly sacrifice, God answered him with fire from heaven on the altar. And that very spot, Ornan's threshing floor, later became the exact geographical site where Solomon's temple was built.
Wow. God met him in his terror, but David had to put skin in the game. He couldn't outsource the cost to Ornan, just like he couldn't outsource the weight of the ark to the oxen.
Full circle.
And that brings us to our final, culminating practical application for you. Reflect on your own commitments right now. Look at your values, your most important relationships, your spiritual life, your community involvement.
Ask yourself the hard questions.
Are you only giving out of your surplus? Are you only offering what is convenient, what the Ornans in your life are willing to hand you for free? True commitment, true love, and true devotion must, by definition, cost you something.
If it doesn't cost you, it's not devotion.
Exactly. If your beliefs, your ethics, or your relationships don't regularly cost you your time, your ego, or your resources, you might just have a hobby, not a devotion.
Man, that is a heavy but deeply necessary thought.
If we pull back the lens and look over this entire deep dive, look at the grand trajectory of these 9 chapters. David's deepest failures, the chaotic, fatal cart incident with Uzza and the ark, his yielding to the flesh and this devastating census, none of them happened when he was weak.
That's the craziest part.
They didn't happen when he was on the run in the wilderness, or when he was hiding from King Saul, or when he was actively under attack by giants. His greatest failures happened when he was comfortable.
When he had it all figured out.
They happened when he was established, wealthy, insulated, and successful. Perhaps our greatest human vulnerabilities lie hidden not in our struggles, but in our greatest victories.
Because when you are struggling, you are dependent. You are alert and listening for the sound in the mulberry trees.
But when you are successful, you are prone to shortcuts, relying on old formulas, and the arrogance of counting your assets.
So true.
So the question I want to leave you with to mull over today is simply this. How are you handling your success today? Are you still humbly asking for direction, or have you quietly started counting your chariots?
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.